Welcome to the Ad-Astra podcast. Today we have with us Dr. Philipp Nothaft of the All Souls College of the University of Oxford. Welcome.
Welcome.
Hi.
Dr. Nothaft is a researcher on many topics, most of which are history of science, the history of astronomy and astrology, and also the studies on time, chronology, calendars in the medieval period and early modern periods. Well, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
So, tell us a little bit about your research into these topics, please.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not really, I don't get to call myself an historian of astrology. Strictly speaking, for most of my career, I've either worked on topics relating to historical chronology, so calendar systems of dating and the history of the study of these subjects. And then on the other hand, more recently, I've been more involved in working on mathematical astronomy. Now, both of these topics have obvious pathways towards astrology. You know, with astronomy, astrology is always lurking around the corner, especially if you work on pre and early modern periods and contexts. And even with historical chronology, you have plenty of opportunities to look at the sort of research that's been carried out by historians of astrology, which is, of course, a growing field, a very exciting field, very productive. It's very difficult to keep up with all the new publications coming out. But for most of my sort of own career as a researcher, I've been more looking at this from the outside, as a sort of observer and admirer of the kind of work that people like you are putting out. But more recently, I've had a chance to study late medieval writings which take, anti-astrological positions and criticize astrology for various reasons and from different vantage points. And it just occurred to me that this is actually a worthy subject of study in the sense that there's an anti-astrological current running through pre and early modern European history, which is, I think, an important part not just of the history of astrology, but also intellectual history more generally, and should be, maybe hasn't received the attention it deserves. And so I'm just wondering if I could add a few data points to what we know about anti-astrological thought.
Yeah, no,
Yes,
that's
of course,
wonderful.
Of course. Yes.
Indeed, I think there's as we were talking earlier in our pre-recording conversation, I think this critique and this wave of critique, as you were saying, it's a current that goes through to the Middle Ages and probably earlier, and goes into it shapes also the practice of astrology. So I think it's quite important to really have a good knowledge of what exactly, who's criticizing, what is the standpoint of these critiques, and how it affects the practice. So I do think it's a very worthy topic of properly exploring and properly doing a history of the critiques of astrology, which I think it's still lacking. We have some works, but it's still a bit scattered, I think.
Yes, that's right. And of course, it's worth pointing out that there's a sense in which the history of anti-astrological thought is almost as old as the history of astrology. Of course, there are astrological ideas which you can trace back much, much further. But when you think of astrology as the Hellenistic system, right, which is really the mainstream of Western astrology, well, that came about in the first century BC, and our earliest evidence for anti-astrological arguments comes precisely from that period, right? Thinking of Carneades and Cicero, some of the first attested skeptics of astrology who come up with some of the arguments that are repeated over and over again as the centuries go by, and of course their arguments are picked up and amplified by the Church Fathers, who add their own more theologically inflected arguments, and that becomes part of the heritage of the way Latin Christian Europeans think about astrology for many centuries, well into the early modern period.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's
yes.
true.
Specifically in Christianity, what we now call roughly Europe, the religious factor had immense importance.
Which doesn't exist in several other factor that doesn't exist in, for example, cultures such as the Indian culture, which has also a rich historical tradition. I'm sure the astrology would have its critics in this environment,
but different.
It's a completely different set, so allows things to develop differently and to be discussed in a different tone. Yeah.
Yes, and what we have to bear in mind is that there's a period of about 600 years from the 6th to the 11th century when Orthodox Roman Christianity was pretty successful in pushing astrology to the margins, especially, again, if you think of the Hellenistic system. There's very little evidence of astrology being practiced in this mode, and you'd be hard-pressed to find any Latin Christian author from this early medieval period who professes any belief in any astrological notions. This is a very marginal pursuit in this period. You know, we have some evidence of prognostications, divination, some of which is astral in nature, but astrology in a robust sense is almost wiped off the surface for about 600 years. And it's only the 12th century that for the first time since antiquity, you have Latin authors who openly profess to believe in astrology or out themselves as practicing astrologers. So you have a completely new departure to a large extent in the 12th century, owing to big knowledge transfer from the Islamic world, and that sets the stage for this boom period in the 14th, mostly in the 15th and 16th century, when astrology is hugely present and culturally impactful in Europe. But again, it's important to see how the influence of Christian religion was successful in marginalizing astrology for a pretty long time period.
Yes.
I'm very, please.
And I was thinking, as you were saying, yes, it does explain, and I think it never was properly addressed, that gap that we have until the 12th century, when you do have the incoming Arabic influences, which are then going to shape completely the way that astrology, the Latin astrology, is practiced. And we do not have, at least not many that I know of, direct links between the old Hellenistic practice and, let's say, a European Christian practice.
Translated 12th century practice, yes. But I'm curious about something. Thinking of astrology not only as a practice, but also as a way of describing the universe, these authors, during these 600 years, they still had to have the so-called Ptolemaic universe with the spheres and everything. So in a way, they could criticize astrology, and they did, of course, and they somehow kind of put it to sleep in a way, but they still had this universe, like with the sun in the center and all the sphere, with the earth in the center, talking like a 21st century person, and with all the spheres and everything. So that they had no other alternative. Even the Bible would be, they would resort to the Bible, of course, but even the Bible describes the world in a way that is not completely against. You know what I mean, I think.
I agree entirely, and I think it's important to point out, as game-changing as the translations from Arabic were in the 12th century, they did not create a cosmological paradigm change. Yes. The basic cosmological assumptions that Latin Christian made about the world they live in are very similar after 1100 to what they were before 1100. And that's, of course, one reason why it was so easy for astrological ideas to sort of reinsert themselves into Western thought and to grow very quickly, because there was a congenial connection between thinking astrologically and thinking cosmologically, to put it slightly vaguely. And of course, there are certain elements of thinking about celestial influence which you find in early medieval texts, or rather the kind of ancient texts that were read during the early Middle Ages. Pliny has a few bits on weather prognostications. It's not like the idea of making sort of predictions based on celestial configurations was completely alien to the Latin Christian heritage, but there was just very little material to work from compared to what's available after 1100.
Yes, specifically in terms of actual practice. I think that's what you mean.
Exactly. I mean, the ability to cast horoscopes, we used to think it was completely gone, but as David Schuster has pointed out quite recently, we have some small remnants of evidence that suggest that people could actually cast horoscopes on a very rudimentary basis. So one has to be careful in generalizing. But overall, when it comes to this rich body of rules, principles, and also mathematical techniques that we usually think of when we think of astrology, was almost completely gone before 1100.
Yes, and it is also interesting to notice that between Hellenistic astrology, what we now call Hellenistic astrology, and the translations, the 12th century translations that are from Arabic origin, there was this 600 years, as you said, gap. And the Arabs were like working on the theory of astrology, and they were like developing it mathematically and even symbolically. They were developing. So there was a difference between the Hellenistic practice, what we now call Hellenistic, and the translations themselves. So they were different. They were like filtered through the Arabic culture and through 600 years of
development.
So that is actually very interesting, because it's kind of two separate. They are obviously connected, but at the same time they are so different in a way that when we get to the 12th century and the translations, we get another thing. It's no longer the original.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so what I'm interested in is the fact that as influential as astrology becomes, and of course, it grows by leaps and bounds. Like I said, by the 15th century, you really get a sense that this is starting to really impact culture on a profound level, and also popular culture, not just elite culture. But as this development unfolds, you have critical voices, and they don't just keep regurgitating the arguments that we already know from antiquity. They actually add some perspectives and nuances to this anti-astrological discourse, and that's where sort of my research kicks in, where I'm starting to sort of become interested to sort of trace what's new and original about late medieval anti-astrological thought vis-a-vis versus what has been said many times before.
Yeah. Can you give us an example? Because I'm really curious. I know of this in temporal critiques about astrology, and then if there is something that is completely new and comes up in the 15th century, so to say, was it a kind of a religious objection or any other kind of scientific?
So, the religious objections, they remain essentially the same, because they're all grounded in the writings of the church fathers. And of course, you have the relevant paragraphs in the canon law, which, can be read as completely outlawing any form of astrology. But of course, people, found ways of interpreting these to make some allowance for astrology. But what happens from the late 13th century onwards in a university context is that, based on their reading of Aristotle, based on their understanding of natural philosophy, some thinkers start to critically interrogate the very idea of astrology, the underlying assumptions about the cosmos, the underlying sort of causal, the underlying causal framework, and they just look at specific astrological doctrines and test them for their internal cohesion, their sort of logical cohesion, and they interrogate astrology from a philosophical rather than a theological point of view. And I think that's new. I mean, of course, there are sort of stock arguments that go back to the ancient skeptics about the practical impossibility of astrology, or the argument from common destinies, like the twin argument, right, where two people are born at the same time, but they have different destinies. I mean, these arguments are repeated anyway, but they actually apply natural philosophy to astrology in new ways, based on the kind of intellectual pursuits that are common at universities in the late 13th and 14th century, when these new arguments come in, and really go into directions that are quite familiar to us. Some of the arguments that are voiced for the first time in this late medieval university context sound very much like the arguments that modern skeptics use when they reject astrology as unfounded or illogical or whatever.
Yeah. Yes, my research has been centered a lot in practice of mainly 16th century, not 16th, sorry, the 17th century, late 16th, in which we already are feeling, and you already can see in doctrine, the changes caused by this kind of critique and revision of the astrological system. I think that to really have a good in-depth research on these points, I think it's quite interesting, so we can understand the changes that we see when you study the doctrine of astrology in, let's say, early modern period, the end of the early modern period, and in medieval period. The bases are the same always throughout time, but the how shall I say, the environment, the way that things are interpreted, the spirit of the interpretation often it's quite different, and I believe that a lot has to do with this critique. So the way that they think astrology and that they use it in interpretation becomes different with all the crossings of these new reflections on astrology. So I think that's quite an important.
And were these criticisms official? I mean, did they wrote books, manifests? How do we find them? Were they really serious or just voices?
So some of the sources that I've studied in the context of this project are sources that really give us a sense of the kind of forum that sort of late medieval authors used to debate astrology. So, for instance, there's evidence that they wrote letters back and forth, right, or circulated letters in which points were debated between supporters and defenders of the astrological system and hardened skeptics. There's evidence that these questions were brought up in university disputations, in quadrivital and other forms of disputations. And then, of course, there are lots of sentences, commentaries, and other types of typical university texts in which these points are brought up, sometimes very randomly, right? One text that I'm working on starts out as a chronological study of the dates of the life of Jesus and other events in world history, and then the author just veers off and goes on this long tangent where he spends half his treatise trying to completely undermine, refute, and reject the very idea of astrology. So you have a very diverse range of different sources, but the valuable take-home point is that they show us people actually debated these questions in a public forum, in a university context, and you have a whole spectrum of opinions. You have those who just adhere to the system of astrology, or for most of it because they trust the authority of Ptolemy or Abu Masha and so on. You have others who accept parts of astrology, or maybe sort of at least sort of the underlying philosophical assumptions, without necessarily paying too much, putting too much stock in individual astrological rules. And then there are those who think it's all complete nonsense, right? You have this spectrum of different opinions, and especially the hardened skeptics are interesting to me because some of their arguments sound, dare I say, modern. At least they sound familiar. And generally speaking, what this debate shows you is that because we sometimes write about the history of astrology in this period as if astrology and the Aristotelian natural philosophical sort of worldview just go together and create and are in this perfect union. But actually, there are certain cracks. And there are certain points of friction. It's not so obvious that Aristotle, that his way of explaining how the cosmos works supports the system of astrology. You have to make a lot of assumptions and also ignore some blind spots to make this work. And of course, the critics are right on that case and point this out quite mercilessly.
Absolutely. I think actually that Aristotle's work were somehow appropriated to support, and for a long time they were the solid support of astrology, but actually it's not direct.
Yeah.
I was thinking of something. It would be a topic in itself, the criticism of astrology and the refutation and the way these arguments go back and forth. It would be a topic in itself, like the story of the discussions of astrology. That would be really interesting.
Because I'm thinking something that I found a lot of lack of, which you for a bit later than the period that you were mentioning. For example, Pico della Miranda's great attack on astrology, which causes a big whirlpool of the turmoil of the discussion. And we have a lot of historical content based on his attack and his arguments, but very, very little on the large defenses that were made almost immediately after the publication against
and others,
which
and that would be
dedicate a lot of page. And that's also another topic that would be interesting to see. How these critics come against the people who defend them? What's the argumentation going back and forth? So
especially if we could organize the criticism in kind of typify, like religious, scientific, or other, and then see how it was responded by the defendant. That would be really interesting. That would go for the history of ideas or something.
Yes,
that would be really interesting.
That would be well, that's a
major work. Maybe your next book.
Yeah, well, I mean, one text I'm working on right now, which hopefully will be out in a year's time as an article-length study and edition, is a defense of one specific branch of astrology, which is interrogations. And as you know, interrogations is one of the more controversial branches of astrology. Even people who, accept, for instance, the possibility of making predictions about the life path of an individual from reading the birth horoscope might scoff at interrogations. And of course, especially once you go to the come to the early modern period, interrogations almost fall by the wayside.
Yeah, almost
rejected as one of the more implausible parts of astrology. And of course, these kinds of worries were already present in the late Middle Ages. And what I found is a really nice defense of interrogations, where the author reports all the criticisms that are made against the idea, and then uses bits and pieces already present in the Islamic tradition to prop up the plausibility that you can actually make these kinds of judgments. I mean, to explain this very briefly, in an interrogation, you cast a horoscope for the moment when a question is asked in order to find the answer to the question. And there are all sorts of implausibilities involving that. So, for instance, it's a very obvious one. The moment of asking the question is preceded by the moment when the questioner, the person asking the question, makes a decision that they're interested in hearing the answer to the question. And of course, there's lots of arbitrariness involved here. The moment when the thought occurs to this person seems more or less random, and then they have to go to the astrologer to consult the astrologer. And in between, there are all sorts of contingencies, right? They might walk past a hot dog stand and decide to have snacks and arrive 50 minutes late at the astrologer. And of course, 50 minutes, that is a long time period in astrology, because on average the ascendant changes every 4 minutes. So all of a sudden the astrologer Sorry?
The degree of the ascendant change is about 3-4 minutes.
Yeah, 4 minutes on average. And again, the question is, aren't the answers that an interrogation will yield completely arbitrary? And so the author that I'm talking about, that I'm studying, he uses some of the already existing ideas that he finds in the sources to argue, no, if it's a proper interrogation, nothing is arbitrary, because there are correspondence relations between the moment of the moment at which you conceive of the idea of asking the question is triggered by a constellation which is in a correspondence relation with your birth constellation, and the moment when you ask the question will again be in a correspondence relation, and so that it's all sort of predetermined. You can still use your free will to override these celestial effects, but there's a sense in which the fact that you in the 30th year of your life will go to an astrologer and ask him a question at this precise moment in time is already inscribed in your nativity horoscope.
So it does establish a parallel between the two.
It's a very good argument. It's a very good argument.
Actually, there were rules to confirm if the horoscope was correct or valid or not. There were a set of rules to confirm that.
Traditionally. And I think it's interesting because I found, well, in Christian, as we were saying, in Christian context, orrery or interrogations simply vanishes from the manuals. Although I do, in my manuscripts, and these are notes of people, they do refer to what they call licit questions. Unfortunately, they don't give examples, which is sad, but they do mention some licit questions. So I do think that there was an underground of activity and trying to revive. Of course, they would practice it underground. That would be obvious, but there is some kind of activity of doing some kind of acceptable interrogation system, which would be in accordance to doctrine. But unfortunately, I haven't seen an example where someone discusses that properly and explains exactly what they intend to as licit interrogation.
Yeah, even for the late medieval period, the amount of material we have to document the actual practice of interrogations is not great, but it's there. We do know for a fact that people use these techniques, and that people actually went to astrologers to ask them relevant questions about, they lost an object, a precious object.
A horse. Where's my horse?
Exactly. Or one of my best friends has disappeared. What happened to him? And then it turns out he was murdered. There's an actual example of this sort in a very influential teaching text of the 14th century. So we do know that interrogations were a thing, and of course the text that I just mentioned shows us that there were people invested in defending this technique against its critics. So you can see how astrology undergoes considerable changes between the late medieval period and the early modern period, but it becomes a bit tamer, where certain less savory parts of it are pruned away because partly of the growing influence of the Catholic Church on the practice of astrology.
And also, when it comes to horary, the criticism was not only about the feasibility of the question, if it is possible to ask questions. I suppose it is also, I suspect it is also about, is it moral to ask certain questions? And I say this because I read in Bonatti, which is quite a earlier, sort a bit earlier, but Bonatti has this kind of, when it comes to questions about women, and specifically about the virginity of women, and I suppose it was a very popular question.
It pops up in every
It
manual.
pops up, yes, and it could ruin the lives of many good people, I suppose. A wrong question. And he says something like, beware not to say too much, or see if the person that is asking is doing it with the intention of tarnish the reputation of the woman and therefore not marry the woman, or basically it says beware, because the woman could have the life ruined by this question. So there is also kind of an ethical concern about certain interrogations, the nature of certain interrogations. So it was probably also something that they would have to take into account. Not only the possibility of being able to ask questions, but also the consequences of certain questions.
Absolutely, and the reputation of astrologers or their profession depended on these kinds of safeguards, because this was a profession that was probably not very reputable throughout this period, and the anti-astrological authors of the period that I'm interested in, time and again, make snide remarks about astrologers as being sort of a caste of suspect people who have low morals and are only interested in material gain. So these are common attacks that are leveled against astrologers as a professional group. So it's perfectly plausible why Guido Bonatti would to make sure to pass himself off as a life consultant who has only the best interest of his clients in mind.
But that kind of criticism that you just said, you find that also within the practitioners. And I mean, at least since Ptolemy himself tries to distance himself from the good practitioners and the lower lives. And you find this throughout all authors, all the classical authors, and they distance themselves, like I do this, or I do this mathematically, I do this ethically, I do this scientifically, and I'm not like those other people, and you find this within the profession of astrologers themselves. That's very interesting also.
Yes, so and there's very good evidence for precisely this line of argument in the late medieval period, and obviously, I mean, that maybe goes without saying, this is also perfectly a serviceable defense. If a prediction goes wrong, you can always say, well, this astrologer who just failed completely at predicting something is an incompetent, is a smatterer, and you shouldn't listen to him. But that doesn't tarnish astrology as a discipline, obviously.
It itself,
a common move to make.
Yeah.
It's quite.
So I think this would be like a book in itself. I'm trying to tease you to write a book.
Yeah. Well, maybe at some point. I mean, what I'm trying to do right now is to get some of those texts out there, some of those previously unknown or at least unpublished texts, make them available to researchers and to produce more limited studies connected to these texts. And maybe at some stage you can synthesize the material.
Yes.
I mean, the main sort of contribution that I seek to make is to fill in a couple of blanks, because it's not like anti-astrological thought plays no role in our current historiography. There's some episodes and individuals who are well known. Combinations of 1277 come up time and again in the literature. Niccolò Rem is usually brought up because he's an influential mid-14th century critic of astrology. And then, of course, the big one, and you've mentioned it already, Luis, is Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who really sends ripples throughout the 16th century with this criticism. But, a lot of the stuff that, for instance, Pico della Mirandola sort of thinks of, the kind of arguments he makes, they are already there, at least in Nietzsche, in 14th century literature, in texts that are almost completely unknown, and so the idea is to have a slightly more cohesive narrative of how this anti-astrological countercurrent developed over those centuries.
Yes, because I think we do have, let's say, Pico della Mirandola is most known in historiography. Just to lay out historiography, Niccolò Rem, as you said, it's also usually one of the sources, that go-to source to explain, well, this comes from much before Pico. Pico does creates these ripples. You do then have the actual prohibitions of the church, which until then they were just admonishments, and there wasn't a law or a mechanism in place to do any regulation, and that has, I think, a profound effect on the practice. But still, we can clearly see that comes from much earlier, but we don't have a picture. So it will be very interesting to finally have more pieces of this huge puzzle and to have a connection, because sometimes it appears that we do have those very early critiques still in the Hellenistic period in the Greek context. Then
religious.
There's a religious critic, then it disappears, and we have all that central Middle Age without a lot. We don't see or we don't know of the discussion, and then suddenly it pops up again in a completely different context, and it emerges almost completely. And there's all the dots missing.
We don't connect the dots
in the interim.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right. Yes. And I mean, what I find interesting about this topic, just to add this very briefly, is that it defies your expectations a little bit, because if you sort of go by what's already well known, you'd think that certain criticisms are much more prominent than they actually are. So, for instance, the moral objection to astrology, that it renders people fatalistic and essentially negates their free will. We always think of this as sort of the major reasons why Christians objected to astrology. But of course, that argument was almost completely defanged by the way 13th century authors came up with the theory of inclination, and how they always pointed out that you can completely reconcile astrology, or almost completely reconcile it with the doctrine of free will. So that's not really the issue. What's at stake here is more the question: does astrology actually work? Does it make sense? Does it comport with the way the world works in a causal framework? And the fact that these questions are asked in such an incisive way, to a certain extent, defies what we sort of assume about the Middle Ages as a kind of knee-jerk assumption.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, exactly. The discussions are much more complicated. It's, as I usually say, when we look at it closely, it's always much more complicated and intricate than we would expect. So yeah, I think that will be a wonderful contribution. So we'll be waiting for your papers coming in as you write them, and then
maybe in the future.
Yeah, maybe in the future we'll know.
Yeah, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Exactly. Another thing that I would like to ask you now, perhaps shifting a little bit of subject, how do you did a lot of chronological studies, and perhaps you already answered a little bit to this. How do you, in your perspective, how much does astrology and or astrological predictions fit in or appear together with this huge chronology work that has been done throughout Middle Ages?
So there are a few examples. I mean, the most obvious connection, I guess, is between the theory of great conjunctions and the way some authors decide to periodize history. They realize, you can actually use the big planetary conjunctions and their supposed effects on major events in world history to chronicle world history along astrological lines. And that is an idea that pops up here and there, especially from the 14th century onwards. A very famous example is, of course, Pierre d'Ailly. And there's a wonderful book by Laura Smoller on Pierre d'Ailly, which was sort of my introduction to the history of astrology back in the day. And now and again, you find authors who, for instance, use astrological assumptions to guess at the age of the world, or maybe the date of the flood, but more commonly the date of creation. But of course, these are not very fine-grained techniques because there's too many variables and contingencies. It's not the most precise way of dating history, but it's an idea that pops up here and there. And if you really study the history of chronology, you will come across such examples.
Yes, because I think, for example, horoscopes of Christ and that kind of discussion that pops up here.
That is another example. Yeah, indeed. And another one is, of course, this idea that maybe the ebb and tide of major world religions coincides with particular planetary cycles or the influence of planets, which is sort of introduced into the Latin discourse by Roger Bacon, and again pops up time and again until maybe the 16th, 17th century.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the Arabs have a lot of literature on this timing of religions and processes, then sips in a little bit into the Latin. But again, the church is not very keen on being regulated by planetary conjunctions, which causes a problem.
Not very happy about it. But even the text that I studied on my PhD, it's a late 15th century text. an author, and he has this study on the conjunction, on the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of 1425 in Scorpio, and he says that there will be a new prophet, and there's still this, and he says this with all the careful way, in the most careful way he can. He's like, I'm Catholic, I'm completely respect the church, but I think that there will be a new prophet. So this was like a very continuous kind of continuous kind. And also he predicts quite wrongly that the Saracens, the Muslims, will be defeated by them. So it's almost there, I think. This was late 15th century.
I think they say that in almost all of the predictions.
Yeah, they always predict that the Muslims will be, the Saracens, as they call them, they will be defeated.
Yeah, absolutely.
Eventually.
It's one of those wishful thinking. Period.
Okay, so.
Well,
we could stay.
Well, we could say and chat a little bit more about much other things, but I want to thank you very much for coming to the podcast. I think it
was a very interesting discussion.
Yes, and we'll be looking forward for your results in this research and for these documents, which I think will be wonderful sources, so we will ground our history in more facts and more information, and I think
and connect more dots.
Yeah,
more dots to connect.
So we can understand exactly for the astro and for the type of research that we're doing, which has a lot to do with this internalistic analysis of the astrology. It's important to understand this kind of discussion, because this type of discussion, religious, philosophical, otherwise, will affect a lot of how things are practiced. Because if a technique or a certain approach or a certain concept is not fully shall I say, grounded philosophically, it will certainly be discarded or it will be limited in its uses. So it's very important to understand exactly what are they talking about, how are they approaching these discussions, to understand exactly how the tools of the trade are being affected and modeled by this discussion. So, again,
thank you,
and we'll be looking forward for your research.
Perfect. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.